What's up guys, Asian here again with another PTS video, and today we're going to be going over the Shadow versus the Lover for stamina DPS. So the Shadow, as you guys might already know, has been buffed as of PTS patch 4.3.2. It is now a base 13%, up from, I believe it's 9% on live right now. So naturally the question is the Shadow going to be the next Mundus of choice for magic DPS or stamina DPS? Now the thing with stamina DPS is that right now the Mundus stone that pretty much almost all stamina DPS go for is the Lover. So when we're talking about comparing the Lover versus the Shadow, we kind of come across an issue that is the penetration values. So there was a little bit of a little brainstorm that had to be done in order to try to find something that would compare the two more accurately than just swapping out Mundus stones. Because naturally, if I were just to swap Mundus stones without really changing or addressing the penetration difference, the Shadow's going to lose no matter what. So I did do those tests though. I did just swap out Mundus stones, but then I also did tests with a different build that kind of addressed the penetration issue a little bit. Basically changed some penetration CPs, changed up some sets, things like that, in order to kind of best compare the Shadow versus the Lover. So I'll show you guys what I did first, and then we'll move on to the actual numbers. So I did 4 different scenarios. So I did a crit class as a Khajiit and a non-Khajiit. So those crit classes are classes that have 10% additional crit damage built into their class passives, so that are the Nightblades and the Templars. And I did non-crit class, same thing, Khajiit and non-Khajiit. So the non-crit class, in this instance I used a Stamina Warden, but it is the Stamina Warden, the Stamina DK, and the Stamina Sork. Those 3 classes do not have the additional crit damage built into their class passives, and they're known, at least I call them, the non-crit classes. Then, of course, Khajiit versus non-Khajiit. The Khajiits have 8% additional weapon crit, which might play a difference, especially when we take into consideration the Shadow. The higher your crit chance, the more damage you're going to get out of the Shadow, the stronger the Shadow becomes. So naturally we have to test the Khajiit versus a non-Khajiit. So the non-Khajiit race I decided to use was the Orc. So that's kind of going to be standing in as a proxy there. The Orc should in theory be the best stamina race, as long as you're able to sustain the rotation, so that's why I decided to go with the Orc here. So I'll show you kind of the setups I had on my Stamina Warden right now. So obviously the only thing I would change out would be the race, but this is actually the setup that I used for the Shadow tests. So the Shadow test, I did 2 things to or I should say I did 3 things to address the penetration issue here. So again, the penetration issue here is that the Lover provides 4196 physical penetration, while the Shadow obviously provides nothing. So if I were just to change my Mundus and nothing else, the Shadow would almost always lose. In fact, they would pretty much guaranteed to lose because we don't have that 4196 additional penetration there. So we had to kind of make that up somehow in order to get a more fair comparison between the 2 Mundus stones. So what I decided to do was I decided to change my offhand to a Sharpened trait. For the Lover, I went with an infused, and then I also changed up my monster helm set. So instead of running the Velidreth, so I did Velidreth for the Lover tests, but for the Shadow tests I used Kra'gh instead, because Kra'gh does give me that additional physical penetration. And then I also adjusted my CP a little bit in order to get that little bit of additional penetration. So on the Lover test I only had 28 points into piercing. Here I had 36 points into piercing, and I dropped Thaumaturge to 52 from 56 and Mastered Arms to 52 from 56. Now for the Nightblade, obviously the Thaumaturge, Precise Strikes, and Mastered Arms values are going to be a little bit different just because of the additional crit damage and the fact that the bow proc scales much better with Mastered Arms obviously. But the idea is still the same. I still use Kra'gh and I still use that Sharpened offhand, and I had 36 points in the piercing in order to kind of make up that penetration difference there for the Shadow tests. And then obviously for the Lover tests I did Velidreth, Relequen Advancing Yokeda, and like I said earlier, I did use Infused on the offhand offhand dagger here. So I did have the Absorb Stamina enchant on the offhand just to help out with sustain. Then I had a poison damage enchant on the main hand, weapon damage infused Maelstrom bow. I did 2 daggers, and I were Advancing Yokeda and Perfect Relequen, Velidreth, or Kra'gh, and then 3 Bloodthirsty with weapon damage glyphs. So again, I did it on a Khajiit, and then I did it on an Orc for Stamina Warden, and then I did Khajiit and Orc on a Stamina Nightblade. Alright, so with all of that said and done, I do have a description of the builds below, my testing scenarios below, if you guys want to kind of check that out for a little bit more detail there. So now let's go ahead and swap over to the actual numbers themselves so you guys can see what's going on here. 1 second here. I do need to shift where my webcam is. Alright, here we are. So here are the numbers here. Let me just separate that a little bit more. Alright, so on the left hand side we have the Nightblade tests, on the right hand side we have the Stamina Warden tests. On the top here we have the Lover, and then on the bottom here we have the Shadow. This is just swapping out the Mundus stones, and then on the bottom, so the bottom, so this is actually the middle. On the bottom here I decided to do this is the Kra'ghs with the sharpened offhand that I showed you earlier. So this is a more accurate representation of what you would actually use if you were going to go with the Shadow instead. So real quick, I'm just gonna really quickly do I didn't put in the percentage differences here, so I'm just gonna do that real quick. But overall you can see the results here divided by, oh, why you go away, this times 100, rounded to the nearest 2 decimal points. Alright, so here we go. That all over. Alright, so for the Lover parses, on a Khajiit Stamina Nightblade I was pulling about 50.8k average. On an Orc I was pulling 52.5k. I will note though that with the Orc I did have to heavy attack 1 or 2 times in order to be able to sustain the rotation. So Orcs did lose that sustain passive, so the Orcs do higher DPS, but you do have that sustain issue there. Now if I just swapped out the Mundus Stone, so I didn't make any changes between the Lover build versus the Shadow build, I pulled 49.8k on the Khajiit and 50.8k on the Orc. That is to be expected again because we're losing a lot of penetration, so we had 2% and 3% difference here. Now if we did decide to go with the sharpened offhand Kra'ghs as the helmet and then adjusted our CP a little bit, we averaged 51.8k on a Khajiit, and then we pulled 53.3k as an Orc. We had a lot of variance here. I was running the Shadow here, so you can see here that 52.2 was our highest parse here versus 50.9, so that is a little bit of a variance here. So that's just something to keep in mind there. So we did see that the Shadow did pull better in this instance, so 1.8% increase in DPS versus and 1.5% increase with the Orc here. And you kind of see the same pattern here with the Stamina Warden as well. So 47.5 with the Lover, 46.4 only changing out the Mundus, and then when we adjusted for penetration we have 47.8 for about a 0.6% difference. Orc 47.6, 46.3, and when we adjusted for penetration, 48.8 for about 2.3% difference here. So it does seem like the Shadow is a fairly strong option here. Now the trouble here is that despite trying to control for the penetration, these are still not one-to-one tests, because we did end up using a sharpened offhand here, and we had to use Kra'gh instead of Velidreth. So this particular build, the build that we basically adjusted for penetration, we adjusted our CPs and things like that with the Shadow, that's going to be, again, it's not exact one-to-one comparison, because Kra'gh is a single target set. With Velidreth, you have a little bit of cleave, you can play a little bit at range with Velidreths, so there is that kind of aspect there. We also lose a little bit of DPS from the Absorb Stamina enchant, lose some sustain. We do gain that additional penetration as well, but this is probably the best way that I can think of to kind of test things out. Just add some CPs to the penetration, add in a sharpened offhand, and use Kra'ghs instead. So the Shadow does seem like a pretty good option for stamina DPS. Now of course there is going to be a few issues running the Shadow. That's mainly in trash pulls. With the Lover you pretty much have that penetration up at all times, which means trash pulls are going to die very quickly. But with the Shadow, despite the fact that you do have that sharpened offhand and you do have that penetration from Kra'ghs, it's still, you don't have quite as much penetration here. So in the parses that I did with the Kra'ghs versus the Lover, I was still a little bit shy of the penetration cap there. I was maybe about 200 to 300 shy of the cap there. I could have shifted a few more points into piercing if I wanted to. So that's just something to keep in mind there. The Lover might be a little bit better for trash pulls just because it's more consistent that way, and you're able to run Velidreth, so you can have multiple spores hit multiple enemies. The other thing with Velidreth too is that you can get multiple spores to hit the same boss if the boss bosses a large enough hitbox versus Kra'ghs where you can't exactly do that. So you are losing some DPS there. So again, not a complete one-to-one comparison, but this is kind of a proof of concept that shows that the Shadow is a potentially good option for a stamina DPS. You just do have to make a couple of sacrifices, and it is fairly dependent on being able to get all those penetration buffs and debuffs from your tank. So you have Infused Torx Crusher, you have Alclash Uptime, you have Minor Fracture. So running the Shadow is going to be a little bit more group dependent and kind of individual dependent than running the Lover. I would probably say still stick with the Lover just because it's going to be more consistent. You can wear Velidreth, which is a pretty big DPS boost if you can get 2 or 3 spores to proc on the same boss. So that's kind of where the Lover versus the Shadow stands for stamina DPS. They're both very good options, but I'd probably lean a little bit more towards the Lover just because of the limitations that you have to kind of make if you are going to go with the Shadow. So that's pretty much it for this build. I guess not build video, this is a PTS video. That's pretty much it for this video. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I do anticipate seeing either the Khajiit crit chance or the Shadow buff be nerfed a little bit in either week 4 or week 5 of the PTS. So if that does happen, I will update these tests and just make another video to kind of reflect those changes there. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.